I'm gonna introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Carlos Gershenson, professor in computer science department at the Institute of Research in Applied Mathematics and in Systems at the University at UNAM in Mexico. Carlos's talk is titled "On the Scales of Selves: Information, Life, and Buddhist Philosophy." I'm gonna now transfer all the power to Carlos.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for the organizers and especially Olaf, who motivated me to develop these ideas and present here. So first, I will share some of the previous ideas on information theory, on life and artificial life, and Buddhist philosophy, and later to integrate them on the discussion of selves and how can we study them at different scales. And I guess that's the main question here would be, what's the best scale to describe life? Because I mean, when we try to define living systems, either artificial or biological, we tend to draw a boundary between the self, that which is alive, and its environment. So, for example, the definition of autopoiesis precisely draws this distinction, and the membrane is explicit about the boundary between the self and its environment. And also concepts like individuality, autonomy, and agency are deeply related to the notion of self, because you need this distinction in order to speak about all these ideas. So I guess that the discussion of selves is central to the discussion of life. It would be very difficult to discuss life or artificial life without distinguishing precisely what's the self and what's the environment. And we can ask where to draw this boundary. I mean, we know that this is arbitrary from general system theory, that it's arbitrary where you draw the boundaries of a system. And some people draw it at the cells scale, or at the organism scale, or societies or colonies, or maybe species or ecosystems, but perhaps also at the biosphere level, or maybe we can also speak about molecules like prions and viruses to have a certain selfhood, even if many people don't consider them alive. And about information, I like this quote from James Blake: "Long-run history is the story of information becoming aware of itself." And since information can be defined as anything that an agent can sense, perceive, or observe, we can describe everything in terms of information. So we can develop so-called laws of information that can be generalized to study evolution, life, minds, and agency at different scales. So instead of trying to start from matter and energy, which is what physics studies, and then trying to understand what's cognition, what is mind, what is agency, we will fall into a dualism, because matter and energy doesn't have many of the properties that we observe in living systems. So to avoid these dualisms, I mean, we can say that information, including meaning, let's say, can describe cognition and life, but we don't need to start outside of information. We can start already with information and see matter and energy as particular types of information, and then we avoid dualisms. And especially soft artificial life naturally is described in terms of information. And Kierkegaard wrote that life is understood backwards but must be lived forwards. And we can say that living is information processing. We have a paper with Keith Farnsworth and James Nelson about this. Of course, there are many ways of describing life, but one of the keys of artificial life is that we can abstract the substrate of living systems and replace it with software or hardware or wetware, and then study the properties. We could call them the informational properties or the organizational properties of living systems, independently of their substrate. And like this, one proposal is to measure the life ratio as the amount of information that an agent produces by itself over the amount of the information that it's produced by its environment. So let's say this distinction between self and environment is also key in this notion of life. And entering into Buddhism, I like this quote of Schrödinger that, as far as I know, he was not Buddhist, or at least not openly, but what he says here is precisely, can be interpreted as Buddhist idea. The world is given to me only once, not one existing and one perceived. Subject and object are only one. The barrier between them cannot be said to have broken down as a result of present experience in the physical sciences, for this barrier does not exist. And this is precisely what Thomas was saying, that there's no distinction between object, subject, and action, but it's rather an illusion. So this is what Schrödinger was also saying, or we could say rediscovering. And I mean, it's extremely quick summary of Buddhist philosophy. I mean, we can say that Buddhist philosophy has studied the mind for more than 2,500 years. And there are different types of philosophies, different schools. The three main ones are Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And we could say that they're complementary. The Hinayana focuses on the individual, Mahayana focuses on others, what's my relationship to others, so it focuses on compassion and wisdom. And Vajrayana looks beyond boundaries, so basically it dissolves distinctions. And so it's not new to relate ideas from Buddhism in cognitive science. Francisco Varela was a practicing Buddhist, and he co-organized these workshops on mind and matter, I believe they were called, that the Dalai Lama also participated. So I mean, there have been many studies already for several decades, also on Buddhist monks or long-term practitioners of meditation. And also there are many ideas on what enlightenment is. One of them is that the ego, or let's say the self, is just an illusion, meaning that it's not real. Precisely because what Thomas was saying, that it's changing constantly. So once we realize that, we become enlightened. The problem is that we have habits and tendencies, and we believe that we are real and that we exist, and then we make all sorts of mistakes because of that. And if we accept that the separation between object, subject, and action is an illusion, then also several Buddhist teachers say that space is information, or space is potential, and then we can also see information as potential. So instead of interpreting information just, for example, as a sequence of bits, zeros and ones, information can also be seen as the potential of having values of either 0 and 1. So with information, you can potentially describe everything. And now, to speak about scales, I mean, we can describe the same phenomena at different scales, but all of them are relevant. And in this diagram, we can see that the lower scales, so elementary particles, atoms, and so on, those would be the lowest scales. The highest scales would be the universe. So the lower scales needs more and more information because we need to give more details. We have more distinctions, and as we increase the scale, we are basically losing information. We are generalizing. We're losing distinctions. So in the high scale, we're basically don't need any information because everything is included there. However, at the lowest scale, since we have potentially infinite information, then everything is possible. So the question would be, okay, what's the right scale to study life? Because one could interpret Dharmakaya, which is the Buddha truth states, as being the highest scale, where everything is included, so form is emptiness. And then at the lowest scale, everything is possible, so emptiness is form. And let's say, to say that everything is included, then everything becomes a tautology. So you don't need information. And then everything that is there already, let's say, it cannot be false. but that's because you made an abstraction and you basically erased all distinctions. So it's interesting, but in specific instances, it might be not the most practical scale. And this quote of Poincaré, already relating to selves, he said, the aim of science is not things themselves, as the dogmatism, their simplicity imagine, but relations among things. Outside this relation, there's no reality knowable. And this to say that we cannot study things in isolation. So of course we are interested in selves, but we cannot define selves in isolation from their environment, because it's related to other selves and to other things and to other scales. So we could define life at the cellular level, as many biologists do. However, we usually define cognition at the organism level. I mean, swarm intelligence would study cognition at the colony level. But we can say that the immune system has cognition at the molecular level, because it recognizes the difference between self and non-self, but at the molecular level. But of course, here we need to use downward causation, which say I would sidetrack into a different discussion speaking about downward causation, but I think we also need to include it in this discussion of scales of self, because it's not only bottom up, but also top down causation. And we can also discuss selves in terms of information. So for example, gliders in the game of life. And depending on the scales at which we describe selves, we can identify different types of scales. So for example, structural scales, which are related to metasystem transitions, those are, let's say, already mentioned and relatively obvious. So cells, tissues, and so on, all the way to biospheres. And we could try to study at each of these scales purpose. What's the purpose of a cell? What's the purpose of a biosphere? Goals, agency, individuality, cognition. And I put consciousness with a question mark because I don't really know what consciousness is. So I wouldn't be able to start studying it in a different scales. But anyway, if we agree on some pragmatic definition of consciousness, then we could also start trying to study it at different scales. And we also know that evolution and selection act at different scales. And also we see that cooperation can be described easily within cells and conflict between cells. So even in social groups, usually cooperation is in group and conflict is out group. So in that sense, perhaps the self would be the groups rather than the individuals, because many ideas from the evolution of cooperation only look at one scale, and probably it would be interesting to look at multiple scales in parallel. And apart from structural scales, we can consider temporal scales. So the cells change at different speeds at different scales. So some of our molecules change with every breath. Some of our cells, like neutrophils, change every few days. And some of our cells and some of our memories last a lifetime. What is maintained is not the components of our body, but our organization. And this can be represented in terms of information. So what also Thomas was saying is that we have this continuity, and even when my components have changed, most of them, I still consider that I'm the same as 30 years ago. And our bodies are only one type of organization. There can be other types of organization at different scales. And of course, I don't know how to call the lifetime of a species or a biosphere, but I think we can also include very long time scales. And this leads us to informational scales. I mean, we can also look in this diagram between different scales, between lower and higher. We can include more or less distinctions. More distinction is a lower scale, but we need more information. And if we lose distinctions or information, we are moving to a higher scale. And my personal interpretation of reincarnation, that it seems to conflict with some of our understandings of in the Western world, is basically you have the same information but different instances. So depending how we describe ourselves, we might be changing constantly. I mean, that I'm already different person than I was 5 minutes ago. If we go to a very low scale, because some of my atoms already changed, some of my molecules already changed, some of my cells already changed, or we might not change at all. So if we lose even more details, then we lose distinctions between individuals. So we can just stack different individuals in the same category, like all Mexicans, or all humans, or all animals, or all cells. And it's like if we have 4 apples and 4 pears, there are different instances, but it's the same concept 4. So in a similar way, if we have some information that can be characterized for a person, then this is not necessarily restricted to instance like a body. So let's say one way of interpreting reincarnation is that you can have this same organization or this same information in different bodies, not necessarily at the same time, but in different times. And then it's like saying all the Mexicans living here, or all the Mexicans who have ever lived, and then you just put them in the same category. And this separation of cells from the environment is artificial, but it's also practical, and I would say even necessary. And the best scales of descriptions of cells will be those at which the decisions are made. So this is a pragmatic approach. So we will not say, okay, the individual or the cellular or whatever scale is the best. It depends on what we're interested. So for example, if we want to make decisions about our biosphere and climate change, we might better forget about our personal issues and our individuality. But if we're hungry, we have to focus on sustaining our decaying bodies. So it's just pragmatical. And to conclude, I would say that cells are arbitrary, but that doesn't mean that they're not useful. They're, I would say, essential to study life. However, they depend on the scale at which they are described. Some descriptions will be more useful than others. And it's precisely, again, this idea that you cannot separate the object, the subject, and action. You cannot say that a self as an object is independent of another self that is describing that self. I mean, of course, it could be self-describing itself. So depending on the subject describing the self, the object can change. I mean, it's simply a way of saying that the same phenomena can have different descriptions. We can describe a cell as a complex system or as a Boolean variable or another description. And the usefulness of different descriptions or the different scales is context dependent. So I think we will be less incomplete if we consider different cells at different scales in parallel, rather than trying to stick with a single scale.
Great, thank you so much, Carlos. That was really awesome. We don't really have time for questions right this moment if we want to be on schedule, but please, as before, all of our attendees, you're welcome to write questions in chat and Q&A, and then we'll come back, and also feel free to come back to questions in a more embodied voice form after our last presentation. So thanks so much, Carlos.